Hello everybody and welcome, both those of you in the room with us and those of you joining us online, very many of you. My name is Eve Patton and I'm Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's research institute for the arts and humanities. And over the past few weeks the Hub has been really honoured to host the exhibition that we're talking about today. We persist, therefore we have hope. Trauma and resilience of Hong Kongers through their art since 2019. This exhibition was the result of a unique collaboration between some of my colleagues, Balaja Kaur from the Centre for Resistance Studies, Nick Johnson from Creative Arts Practice, and Dr. Mandy Lee, who joins us from the School of Medicine, and you'll be hearing from more shortly. But it is also the product of a collaboration with a really special group of people, and these are the 7 artists whose work was prompted by the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, and who have very generously shared their work and their time with us. And I know that over the past few weeks, since the exhibition opened, we've had very many visitors who've come into the Hub to look at the material on the walls. Many more have viewed the exhibition online, and many people have simply walked by the front display window of the Long Room Hub building and have seen in the window the 2 yellow umbrellas, which is our feature symbol of the protest movement. So it's had tremendous resonance, and for us in Arts Humanities in Trinity, this exhibition has been, I think, an opportunity not just to think about the relationship between art and resistance in Hong Kong, but about how art and resistance relate to each other right across the world. So it's meant a great deal to us, and it meant a great deal to see the multi-layered and very considered response that the work has received here in Dublin. Over the next hour or so, we're going to be talking more about that response and what the exhibition does mean. But first, I'm delighted that for this panel on the exhibition, we're joined by the Provost of Trinity College, Dr. Linda Doyle, who's now going to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Eve. Thanks, Eve. Thank you, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I had the pleasure of my own private tour with these 3 wonderful people the other day, and it is a magnificent and fantastic and absolutely beautiful and moving exhibition. And I felt I got to see it. Mandy did an amazing job, actually, with Balas and Nick in explaining things. But I've been thinking about it since, kind of in the broader terms of kind of the world of education. And at the moment, for me, there are kind of 3 major things that are happening in the world of education that I think kind of are relevant to this space. And kind of, Eve, maybe taking up on some of the things that you just said in terms of what does it mean for us. So one of the first things that we're seeing, and I think this is very much to do with the war in Ukraine, is a kind of retrenchment. There's a kind of a move away from understanding that globalization is a good thing, from understanding that outward looking is a really good thing. And there's actually kind of you can feel people kind of nearly going like this. And, we talk now much more about academic interference when we think that kind of, whereas before we were talking about how are we more open and how do we bring things to more people. So to me, it's really, really worrying that kind of, folding inwards is happening. And that's why I think this kind of exhibition, the Centre for Resistance Studies, the looking outwards, is the different cultures is so important. The second thing I see that's really, really big thing that's happening, and we see this particularly in Europe, you see now that the focus is, I think, very worryingly moving away from things like research to defence. And we come from a country here where I suppose we have a particular view on neutrality and various different things, but that focus on defence ultimately will erode the focus on education in terms of what's spent on education, in terms of what's spent on research. And when I look at this exhibition, I think about the ways you can resist, and I think your centre, Ross, you think about resistance and think through many different ways, and I think the world greatly needs that. And the third thing that's really, really that you see right across the world in institutions is an erosion of autonomy. And we see it ourselves in Ireland in some of the kind of legislation that kind of centralises some of the control of the universities more and more. But it's part, and while you might not think it's not too bad here, it's part of a worldwide trend where this notion that, you know, people can be completely free, critical thinkers, independent. You know, we're here not to agree with the state, but to challenge the state, to challenge society. That actually is being slowly eroded. And sometimes it's being eroded in, you know, I think in a kind of very quiet way, and sometimes obviously in a very loud and powerful way in Hong Kong. So to me, the kind of themes that matter in this in a much more real way, because I'm not saying in any way that, you know, I haven't had the experience of many of the people in Hong Kong who have, you know, put as the posters say there, you know, not to fear, and have been so brave in kind of how they deal with resistance. But I think this is an exhibition to me that is important in the kind of general life of a university, where a university is going, and the kind of things that we in the world need to stand up for. So I was really, really pleased to see it. I was really pleased because I really do believe in interdisciplinarity. I think I actually always wish we had a School of Art actually in Trinity, and I think it is an amazing way for people to actually communicate, to express things. One of the things I find about working with artists is artists themselves tend to be quite fearless in taking on really, really thorny, difficult, complicated issues, and just actually being brave in how they express the world that they want to have. So I have to say I applaud hugely the artists. I not alone is the work amazing and moving, I think they are a brave bunch of people in standing up for what they believe in. I think the three of you, I think Nick, Mandy and Laza, have just been amazing in all of you've done. As usual, the Long Room Hub is just outstanding. I'm always in awe at the number of events you have, the inclusivity of it, the groups of people that you bring together. I think the School of Creative Arts, and I know the Samuel Beckett Theatre and the technicians were involved. Nick explained to me how they got those boats floating over there, which in true Trinity style fashion was not easy, and involved a lot of engineering. I'd say engineering comes in handy every now and then. So to me, this is a real work that is both powerful in what it stands for, brave in the world that we live in, brave in a world where I am learning as the days go by that the things that we have taken for granted even here are kind of being eroded. Beautiful, moving exhibition by an inspiring bunch of people from a centre. I love the name of your centre as well. And I was very, very privileged, as I said, to get the most lovely exhibition of it. So I would say, you know, congratulations to you all on putting on such a powerful event. I hope we will have more of them. And I know, you know, we can celebrate this and celebrate the beauty and powerfulness of the art here, but also knowing of the difficult situation in Hong Kong. And I think there is that kind of mix of feelings when you look at it that you can't kind of escape from. And I think it's really good as well because, you know, the sad thing is there are so many terrible things happening in the world that things become invisible very, very quickly. And this is another way of kind of bringing back visibility to the situation in Hong Kong. So thank you so much for asking me to say a few words, and I'll pass back to you now.
Thank you so much, Provost, for that wonderful introduction to our event. It means so much to have you in your capacity as the head of the university to join us at this webinar. My name is Mandy Lee. I am from the Center for Health Policy Management at the School of Medicine. And our opening launch back on the 11th of May, we organized an artist roundtable as our intention was to center the voices of Hong Kongers. We heard from our 6 participating artists their stories of creating and sharing art in conditions of repression, of the unrelenting harassments that they had, which led some of them to exile from Hong Kong, and of their aspirations to continue to speak out for Hong Kong. For today's webinar, we would like to put these Hong Konger stories into international context. Our exhibition project is transdisciplinary, and which puts an emphasis on civic engagement, and we are very honored and grateful to have 2 excellent speakers with us today. Between them, they have an established profile not only in academia, but also in the creative arts field and in civil society. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. Our first speaker is Catherine Marshall, who is a curator and art writer and was the former head of collections at the Irish Museum of Modern Art from 1995 to 2007. She has lectured at Trinity College Dublin, UCD and the National College of Art and Design. Throughout her career as the leading historian of 20th and 21st century Irish art, Catherine has spent most of her career outside the classroom, organising pioneering exhibitions in museums and galleries around the country and around the world. In 1995, she became the founding head of collections at the then newly established Irish Museum of Modern Art, where she championed the inclusion of what is termed outsider art, as well as empowering secondary school students to share in the art in the work of curation. She was visual art advisor to the Arts Council touring Ireland in 2007 and was joint editor of the 20th century volume of the Royal Irish Academy's Art and Architecture of Ireland, which became the standard reference work on the subject. She was awarded an honorary doctorate in the history of art by University College Dublin in 2019. Catherine will share her views of our featured Hong Kong artworks in the context of protest art both in Ireland and internationally. Our second speaker is Jessica Ní Mhainín, who is a policy and campaigns manager at Index on Censorship, an organisation that protects and defends freedom of expression worldwide. In her role, she has coordinated a number of research projects and campaigns aimed at raising awareness of and improving the state of freedom of expression around the world. She has prior experience in international human rights advocacy through her work at Frontline Defenders and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I know from speaking with our Hong Kong artists that how much Jessica has been a support to them over these past while. Jessica will speak about art and censorship in the context of the Artistic Freedom Project that they're currently conducting at Index. So we're extremely grateful to have both of you with us today. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. And without further ado, I hand over to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Mandy. And thank you to the curators for inviting me to be part of this. I'm very honoured to be a part of it because I saw the exhibition when it opened first and was really impressed, not just by the quality of the artwork, but also, of course, the incredible achievement in just getting that art made and getting it out in the first place. Because to get it out, you have to have support and you have to have curators on your side in other places in the world. And obviously they did that, and of course it took great courage to do that. So Mandy asked me to talk about setting art and protest into an international context briefly. So I'm going to do that first by just naming a couple of key artists around the world, and then to talk a little bit about our experience in Ireland, where we haven't had in recent years to deal with the kind of repression that you're talking about at all, but nonetheless we have had some experiences, and women have had it everywhere forever anyway, so let's just get that said and move on. Just to start, something that struck me very much from the catalogue of this exhibition that the three of you curators put together were words attributed to Lumley Lumlong, which are, and I'll quote, "Compassion is the ultimate expression of one's imagination." I hadn't thought about that before. I think about a number of things as the ultimate expression of one's imagination, and I think about, individuality, for instance. But of course, that is absolutely right. So if these words belong to one of the three of you, rather than specifically or paraphrasing Lumley Lumlong, I'm very grateful for it. Might come back to the three of you again sometime in the future on that, because I see an application for that already in an artwork, in fact. Another thing that I was very taken with in your catalogue was the emphasis on Professor Tighe's 10 principles. And in particular, I like the one that says think local, because we live in such a global world that finding time to be local and coming very much closer to the individual is a real challenge for all of us. And of course, that completely extends Lumley Lumlong's point about compassion. You can't be compassionate unless you direct that compassion at something or some person, and ultimately some person. So it is all about the individual and where the individual fits into the bigger scheme of things. And then looking at Hong Kong, and in particular that event in Hong Kong that inspired a number of the artists in this show,
the 12 youths who took the boat and have not been seen since. They look so small in the bigger scheme of the world and the ocean that they set off in their little boat and just disappeared into some kind of awful void. It immediately sets the individual up against the global, I think, against the big, dark, past, present, future geography that we all have to contend with. And it's a recurring motif throughout this work. So I thought it's very, very important to think about the local and reinstate the importance of it. Everything happens in ourselves and with our neighbours and moves out from there. So let's look at a few of the big international practitioners. I made a note of a few people that stood out for me, partly because I have had connections with some of them through my work at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and partly just because they are such important figures. So one of them is the Russian artist. Sorry, take that back immediately. Should be beheaded for this. It is the Ukrainian-born Russian-American artist Ilya Kabakov. Kabakov came out of the Soviet system in the 1940s and 50s, having been liberated from Ukraine, which was then, of course, attacked by the Germans in World War I, liberated to Russia and educated in Russia as a young man. Then he went on to make art within the Soviet system, but immediately realized that all the challenges and the repressiveness of the Soviet system, especially in the 1950s, because Nikita Khrushchev had made a big statement about modern art, completely condemning modern art and expression in the modern age. And so Kabakov asked himself, how could he deal with that? How could he resist that? And he did something that really, well, he's now known as the father of Russian conceptualism. He did something that was incredibly successful both at home in Russia, where it wasn't understood entirely, except by his own immediate soulmates, and immediately by the rest of the world as it got out. He made work that seemed to conform exactly to what the state agreed with. So he made very academic art. But he made it so subversive in such nuanced and minute and detailed ways that only the people who really liked art enough to study it as artwork got what he was doing. And so, for instance, he decided to be quite autobiographical, and he produced a series. He created a character who sets out to write his autobiography in Soviet Russia in the 1960s. And then this man realized that he had nothing to write about because his life under a very repressive communist regime was so repressed that he had nothing to talk about. He got up every day, he ate his meal, he went to work, he came home, he ate another meal, he went to bed, and that went on from birth to death. So he created 10 imaginary characters, and the 10 imaginary characters become like fairy tale figures almost. They appealed across all age groups because there was a magical element to them, but there was also a deeply subversive element. So they escape out of their ordinary lives in ways that people could not without the power of the imagination. And it was up to other people with the imagination to understand what Kabakov was referring to get all of the meanings of that. So I offer that in Kabakov's practice as a model of, I think, outstanding and very successful artwork that is also very successful as a resistance statement. So another person who I think it's worth mentioning is a German artist called Hans Haacke. Hans Haacke began what is usually thought about in history of art terms as institutional critique. He, actually, excuse me, I'm going to just have a drink of water, if that's okay. did a lengthy interview this morning with somebody unscheduled because her flight into the country and out again this evening was so delayed because of airport difficulties. So that threw me, means I haven't prepared this talk as well as I'd like to have done, and also I need a drink. Hans Hacker looked at, he moved from Germany to live in New York. He looked at the situation in New York where he found it and realised immediately that he had to expose the corruption within art that arose from the connection between art and capitalism, art and money. So he looked at how the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York was really corrupted in what it did because of its connection to big capital. And he also looked at the American system. So I've just had some typed notes. I'm going to give you an account of one of his first big projects there. He proposed to MoMA that he should do an exhibition, an installation, which was a new thing in those days anyway, entitled the MoMA Poll, a voting poll. But he didn't hand in the specific question that he wanted to ask audiences to MoMA to vote on until the day the exhibition opened. Instead, what he did was he had plexiglass boxes placed within the exhibition space into which visitors could put a yes reply to the question or a no reply. And on the day the exhibition opened, they were given the question. So MoMA didn't have time to vet the question beforehand. And the question back in 1970 was, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not announced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for your not voting for him in November? And of course the audience immediately filled up the plexiglass boxes with things saying yes. The yes boxes were filled instantly, the no boxes got very few votes. But the question wasn't just a question about Nixon's policy and how Americans felt about that. It was also about Governor Rockefeller, who had not announced it, and the fact that Nelson Rockefeller was then the biggest trustee, and I think he was the chairman of the board of MoMA, so he was critiquing MoMA at the same time, and critiquing how institutions like that are run by big money and so on. And Hacker went on to do more projects like that. I don't want to spend too much time talking about him, but that's institutional critique, and I think anybody who seriously wants to resist through the visual arts anywhere has to find ways of doing that. They're not impossible. So very good other example, and this is a very feminist one, is the Gorilla Girls, who are women artists in New York who came together in the 1980s to critique the fact that every show was made up of male artists with at best maybe a token woman. So they wore gorilla masks and they quite publicly, invaded exhibition openings and things, drawing attention to themselves as women who were very visible as gorilla women, but not visible as artists within the shows. But it's really the smaller things they did. I mean, they got huge publicity for that, and they published manifestos that turned up everywhere, on the back of a cornflakes packet, on the side of a bus, went from the tiny to the very large. And their posters took the form of things like a manifesto saying, here are the advantages of being a guerrilla artist. So to be a guerrilla artist, you don't have to worry about tenure in your teaching job, because you're not going to get tenure because you're a woman. You don't have to worry about, in those days, there's a context for everything. Jean-Michel Basquiat had painted a self-portrait painting in the studio wearing an Armani suit. You don't have to worry about your Armani suit because you'll never afford one, and so on. But the Gorilla Girls nowadays, and they're still going strong, have taken on, they're not just white American women anymore. When I met them in New York a couple of years ago, they had a young Syrian migrant artist working with them and a woman from Afghanistan. So, they're looking around the world. They are looking at wherever resistance needs to happen and how best it can be done. And then, just as one form that caught my attention, especially looking at the Lenin wall at the end of this exhibition, is they created bookmarks with powerful questions about the place of women in art or whatever their particular protest is about. And they sneaked into the bookshops of the big American art galleries and sneaked the bookmarks into, hundreds of books. So anybody who bought a catalogue of a, smart new exhibition took it home and found this quite subversive question dropped into the middle of it with a little, joke, it's the Guerrilla Girls thing on the bottom. And so I would recommend that people who are interested in protest just have a look at their strategies. Okay? Then it occurred to me, looking at some other artists who engage in protest, and like some of the artists here in this show, like all of the people who refer back to the 12 in the boat, the importance of memory and telling the story of those events and keeping them alive. So in 2000, in England, Jeremy Deller got 1,000 people from the Midlands in England together to restage a famous confrontation between the miners in England and Margaret Thatcher during the miners' strikes. It was called the Battle of Orgreave. And you might ask, why would somebody spend all the money it takes to reenact something like that in the early 2000s? It's because Jeremy Deller could see the way things were shaping up again, and the awful poverty and the residues of trauma, actually, that the miners and their families had suffered as a result of the Battle of Orgreave. And he knew the importance of finding an outlet for that, and also reminding people of that solidarity that they had and where that solidarity would lead them in the future. So then just one or two other strategies coming back to closer to home in Ireland. When IMA opened in 1991, the founding director, Declan McGonigal, said it would be nonsense for us to try to copy other museums of modern art around the world. For a start, we're 100 years later than all the rest. They've all had their go since the 1920s at least. 1991 is a bit late to come to the game. So we said it's no good us doing this unless we do something different. So we're not going to be a museum of modern art. We're going to be a place that questions what art is and who is an artist. How do you get into a museum? So take the institutional critique on board and run with that. Now, I joined in those pioneering years. And I must say, for all of us who worked there in the first decade, it was probably the inspirational experience of our lives. None of these things last. It became very successful, and I think success brings another kind of challenge that you have to resist, and that's beginning to happen now. I think, there was a lull for a couple of years. But one of the important things that did happen during that time was that they put on an exhibition of people, women from the local community. They called it Unspoken Truths, because these women had never told their stories before. Now, to cut quickly to the chase here now, I'm going to stop and hand over to Jessica. I was working here in Trinity College as an art historian teaching art history when that exhibition happened. And I brought my students up to a seminar about unspoken truths at IMA. And I was so inspired by it that when they asked me then if I'd come and work up there, I left IMA. I started working in Trinity. I left Trinity like a flash. I was up there within 3 weeks. Because I was going from being a historian to helping to make the history. But what I was thrilled about when I got there was that IMA was already starting its next phase in that exhibition of completely unknown members of the community putting on their own exhibition, to inviting them back to do another one. And this time the women had opted to make work about domestic violence. And I got to know all of those women and work with them now, still. But one of them in particular, I remember, told me that when the first exhibition happened in 1993, she couldn't read or write. She had dropped out of school so early and had never had the confidence even to speak about it. because she was in an exhibition with other women and they were telling their stories for the first time, she just gained so much of a sense of self-esteem from that in 1996, when they were preparing for the second exhibition, she was nearly too busy to take part because she was writing letters, churning the letters out to women in the Philippines in a solidarity campaign protesting against sex trade trafficking in the Philippines. So I suppose all of these things are about protest and resistance. There are so many ways in which this happens. I would be saying to the artists in Hong Kong, we're all there together in this. We are all, but almost I think by definition, art has to be involved in resistance. Any art that's any good is always centred on resistance. There's just no compromise on that, I think. And so we're all in this together, and we will find ways of helping each other. I would be saying to the Hong Kongers, contact some of these people that I've mentioned, and they will lead you to other people. Be part of that bigger group of people in the world who can help you. And another thing I thought about, thinking local. Think very locally about Hong Kong itself and all of the ways that you've already used to make really, really interesting art. And see if you can glean a few strategies from some of these other people that I've mentioned as well. But then I thought, invade China, just move into China and start. The Chinese authorities are looking at Hong Kong right now. They're not looking at the rest of the country in the same way. So the thing to do might be to spread some of the fantastically heroic subversive message out into the rest of China and watch where it goes.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks a lot. Thank you again to the curators. It's a privilege to be here today speaking at the closing event of this just fantastic exhibition and speak about some of the work some of our work in Index and Censorship as it relates to artistic freedom as well. So at the opening event, I was lucky enough to meet with several of the artists. And to begin with, I actually want to draw on what artists Lum Ní, Lum Long said during their contribution at the time. Although we are now in the UK, we are not totally safe here. We have to be careful because our families are still in Hong Kong. They described how several of their social media accounts were hacked and blocked in April, and how their card details were stolen in what they believe might have been an act of retaliation for participating in an exhibition in London. We know that the Chinese authorities are exerting their power and influence around the world to stifle dissenting voices like those of Lum Ní, Lum Long, basically particularly on issues that are of strategic importance to the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong's national security law was also raised in the opening event, and it is an explicit means of exerting this power. The wording of the law asserts jurisdiction not only on Hong Kong, but also for those that have never even set foot in Hong Kong. But we know that the Chinese authorities are also exerting their influence in more covert and chilling ways. Lum Ní, Lum Long have good reason to believe that the Chinese authorities might have been behind the hacking of their social media accounts, but it would be very difficult for them to ever know for sure. The Chinese authorities do engage in that kind of activity, but how can you know whether it was a random hacker or whether it was a targeted attack by a state operative? And that has a really, I think it's inclined to instill anxiety and even paranoia in those that it targets, and that's particularly aimed at encouraging, if not even forcing, people to stay silent, to basically self-censor themselves and their art. Many of these same tactics, threats, surveillance, hacking, were outlined in Index and Censorship's report, China's Long Arm, How Uyghurs Are Being Silenced in Europe, which we published earlier this year. To quote one of the individuals we interviewed for that report, she said, "I never thought people would get censored in Europe. I never thought that China would have such a long arm to choke someone's throat." And that was an ethnic Uyghur from Xinjiang who now lives in Sweden. She said, "You cannot physically see it, but you know it's there." So that report was published as part of an ongoing project that we're doing called Banned by Beijing, which specifically focuses on how the long arm of the CCP is silencing inconvenient voices in Europe. And our next report will actually specifically focus on how this arm is affecting artists and artistic freedom in Europe. Artists particular, because as some of the artists, including Lum Long, pointed out in their opening contribution, at the opening event, is that it can evade certain automated censorship, like AIs online and things like that. I believe they said that they should be focusing not on writing but on art for that particular reason. But we know that from speaking from Hong Kong artists, Uyghur artists, Tibetan artists, and mainland China artists, other mainland China artists, that who are now based in Europe, again I reiterate, that the Chinese authorities are trying to interfere with their abilities to engage in their work. But to what extent? So we hope that our report will be able to shed some light on that. As I said, we're hoping to publish it later this year, so I unfortunately can't share any further insights into that at this point in time. But one of the things that we hope to achieve by this is to really awaken governments and indeed the social media companies as well to actually take action to support and protect the artists. Because as the Provost said, these are things that are being things like human rights and democracy that we're taking for granted here are actually being eroded, and this is one of the ways, I think, how they are. Lum Long, again, to quote them, I know Catherine, you quoted them as well, they said, "We think we'll continue to speak because we always say to ourselves, if we shut up, why didn't we just stay in Hong Kong?" I think the fact that artists would even consider remaining silent is a damning indictment of our democracy's capacity to protect human rights and artistic freedom. Hong Kong artists, as we can see very clearly here, have shown huge resilience in the face of trauma, and those who have left Hong Kong are continuing to show resilience in the face of continued harassment and attempted interference. We need to continue to support and champion them, those in Hong Kong and beyond, as this exhibition does. So thank you again to the curators for bringing us together here today to have this, I think, important discussion and to support the artists who I think are in need of our support.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for coming. So with our remaining time, our idea is to open for some discussion, and I'm going to begin that by just prompting a few of the threads and trying to unpick some of the aspects of the conversation so far between our two speakers, but also reflecting back on the sort of keynotes that were sounded at the very beginning by Eve Patton and by our Provost Linda Doyle. And I think something I've been thinking about as I've been listening is that we all have experiences of institutions. We're speaking here of in an institutional context in a university, within an institute. We're speaking, I know you have both experiences, the educational and the cultural, and that kind of public facing. And then in the NGO sector and the sector that is holding power to account, but also deeply involved with states and state action, government business. It strikes me that, in a way, we're living in an era that we think of as increased openness. And many of the artists who we're displaying here have benefited from social media as an idea and the technologies that have allowed us to connect with each other, to find contact, to find solidarity. And yet those same avenues, those same tools, can then be exploited for the opposite purpose, right? That openness flows both ways. So I wonder what guidance the two of you might offer just from your experience, from seeing how institutions have reacted to that sort of bilateral openness. what do you have any ideas for how we might preserve some of the openness of institutions, the flow, the inward, that kind of openness and outward-looking quality? And obviously, in a free society, that means also tolerating dissent, opposition, antipathy toward that view, whatever is presented. How can we make our institutions in the current environment still resilient to have that? Where do we stand on those types of questions of freedom and openness in institutions? I'd love just to hear your comments on that.
Want to go first?
Sure. I think one of the things that we need to be really careful about, especially now, is for democracies, is to be really careful not to dip in, especially when we are seeing a rise of misinformation and disinformation, as well as not to dip into that autocratic tendency just to censor, or even to preemptively censor in some cases, as there's a risk of what's happening. I think there is a need for awareness of the importance of freedom of expression in general, and I'm including artistic expression in that, of course, and to understand why that's important. Not and I think here it's very evidently important as a tool of democracy. And why is it that we should value democracy? I think that's a conversation that needs to be had in the education sector as well, even starting when, in schools, far before university. I think that's something that needs to be, particularly in Ireland, we don't have that same emphasis at school level on things on issues like philosophy and politics and things, I think, which is really important. Having people understand the role of freedom of expression, media freedom, artistic freedom in democracy. So I think that's one of the ways where we can hopefully maintain that openness as well, and that kind of understanding. But it's an extremely difficult question. I mean, even dealing with misinformation, disinformation, for example, it's something that's not easily done. But I think having open debates, open discussions, and things like fact checking, things like independent media, all of those things, I think, are key to maintaining that.
Yeah, I would echo that, actually. I think as well as just talking and listening to people, I would emphasise listening. I think we should teach small children from the earliest age to just listen to themselves and listen to other people, and then to think about it. And I suppose the other thing is we all make mistakes. Acknowledge the mistakes, and in my life I have found that I learn almost nothing from the things that I do that I get a pat on the back for. But when somebody points out my mistakes, I immediately get to work to try and fix it. So I think critique is terribly important. Ireland's a tiny country, and one of the things that we suffer from in this country is a lack of distance to make the sort of critique of each other's practice that would be really useful. We're very polite and slow to do it, and I know why. It's because, the critics, and I write criticism myself at times, I don't want to say anything that might interfere with an artist or a writer's really fairly, reduced opportunity to make a living on an island this size. So you try not to say anything negative. But actually, it's very important to give constructive criticism as well, and I think that's a very hard thing to do. But if we were all encouraged from the earliest age at school to learn to take constructive criticism, it wouldn't be hard at all, it would be a very positive thing. So I'd say listening, I would really put a huge emphasis on listening. And then the other thing about institutions is boards of government, and that goes from the institutions, boards, right up to government departments. They are so dependent on, who makes them up at any one point in time. You can go from being a very good institution in a period of 2 or 3 years to being a very mediocre one, depending on who's on the board and who has power and authority. And I'd watch that one very carefully. We're not half careful enough. And actually, another thing I've always thought it would be great to do is to have in a university, I don't know how it is now about student ratios on the board of Trinity College, but I would love For instance, I'm on the boards of a number of arts organisations, community arts organisations around the country, and I'm always trying to persuade them to have children on their boards. Haven't succeeded yet, but I'm working on it.
Excellent. Both very, very useful, I think, in trying to stitch together some of the ideas that we've brought up. I would like to flag, I suppose, the origin of this project, and in the title of the project are these words, trauma and resilience. We're speaking partly because of Vandy's area of expertise. We are drawing out of a somewhat, let's say, medical aware framework for what art might mean, how there could be health implications for individuals and society, both in making art and in consuming art. And I think that at a closing event we would want to reflect on this, and I think one of the ways I'd like to get into that is through your focus, Catherine, on compassion. And that compassion as one of the threads that you saw really running through this. And I feel that it might link well to the listening comment that you just made as well, that compassion for self, compassion for others around us, compassion for those voices that fall outside of the mainstream or that are repressed by the context or the culture of the society, and compassion for those with whom we disagree and for those who disagree with us. And I wonder if we think that communities of care emerge differently when art is at stake and in these kinds of emotional, straight to the heart connections. You know, my experience as a curator of these was fascinating because even when we can't all read the script that's on some of these texts, we don't speak the language necessarily, and yet something kind of cuts through that to us at an emotional level. And so I suppose I'd love to hear you reflect on wellness and art and compassion, whether it connects to that for you, and just as probably a final thought of this phase before we transition to either audience questions, if there are any, or my fellow curators for their closing word. I'd love to have our kind of last note sound on that issue of compassion, listening, wellness, and art, whatever you make of those clusters. Yeah. Thanks.
That's absolutely huge. At some point in my past history, I started off to do a PhD here in Trinity in response to a question posed by the then Professor of History of Art, who was very Anglo-Irish, and therefore I suppose it would be seen to be a representative of the class that dominated Ireland, that ruled us. There was us and them, and they were definitely them, and I was definitely us. And I said, okay, I'm going to sort this question out once and for all and give it right back to you. And what I was trying to prove to her over a period of a year or two before I got sucked into other things and left it aside temporarily, is that, you know, the visual arts are very connected with money, whether you like it or not. It takes money to make visual art, for instance. And during a history of awful poverty in Ireland, outside of that ruling class, who had art and did commission artists who were their friends to make work and so on, the vast majority of the people of Ireland were starving and struggling and so on, culminating in the Great Famine in the middle of the 19th century. There is almost no art reflecting the famine, no visual art. There is a bit of writing, there is song about the famine, because it doesn't take money to make songs, it doesn't take money to write small pieces of writing. Maybe it takes money to get them published and to get an audience for them, but the songs, the oral tradition was very, very strong, and particularly still in the Irish language. The visual arts hadn't a chance. And so by the 20th century, 50 years after that famine, Irish artists had a terribly low sense of themselves. They didn't make art about their own history, and if anything, they tried to suppress it. And it wasn't until the 1990s that an artist called Alana O'Kelly, very important woman artist in this context, realised we had never even properly talked about the famine or mourned for it. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with the story, and 2 million people died in the space of 6 or 7 years out of a population of 8 million, and another 3 million people emigrated, so that within 10 years of the outbreak of the first phase of the famine to the decade later, the population had been reduced almost to half. It was unspeakable, really, if you think about it. And I think that had a terribly traumatising effect on people, all the more because they couldn't speak about it. The survivors had survivor guilt, the dead were dead and couldn't speak anyway, and it went on for generations. Alan O'Kelly did a project that, over a period of years, that was all about just mourning for the dead. That's what she did. She taught herself to keen, which is the old Irish form of lament. And so she keened for the dead in places that were associated with family burials and so on. And she made visual art about it. Very moving, very powerful visual art. And then the nation got behind it and thought, well, this is fine. We can deal with the famine now. And another thing, we hit a period of prosperity in the early noughties. And suddenly, a confident Ireland could look at its history and make something out of it. And what did they do? They made big bronze boats that they put in, in outside the UN headquarters in New York and places to say the Irish have arrived. But it had nothing to do with that deeper story, which is only now, I think the trauma of all of that is only beginning now to be dealt with in this country. And that's just our experience. And it was a slow build experience compared to some of the awful things that we're talking about now in the world. So yeah, I think trauma is huge, and the wounds last for generations. Although there's study on that, I know, and somebody disagrees with what I'm saying, but I grew up with famine guilt, and I was born 100 years after the famine, so I know I had it, because I still feel elements of it.
Yeah, I can just maybe pick up briefly, again putting it in a bit in an international context in terms of when I think about art and wellness, and not being an artist, maybe I'm not well placed to judge, but it seems like there's a type of catharsis maybe there as well, and it's kind of useful as an outlet. But I know, so we also, at Index, we also have another project which is about getting letters it's called Letters from Lukashenko's Prisoners, which is about getting letters from political prisoners in Belarus and actually getting them out of the prisons there and translating them and publishing them. And many times with we see the handwritten letters, and there's, artwork on them. There's doodles and there's images and things like that, and I think as well there's a lot more, and this was something that the artist, I think I mentioned as well, and which the artist said, is that there's a way of being kind of creative in artwork in a way that you can't really be in words, and kind of getting things under the radar, because of course we know that when we're getting the letters from the political prisoners in Belarus, they can't just say whatever they want, right? They have to be very careful, they have to avoid certain trigger words that could see the letters just being disposed of before they even make it out. So I think even seeing that, and that's that form of communication, that enables communication actually as well, which is so important for prisoners who are facing, one of our former colleagues at Index is facing 20 years in prison for treason. He's going to be tried next week, and I think that the block of that flow of communication is obviously, it must be taking a horrible toll on him, but at least we see that the prisoners are using, even if they're not artists, little doodles and things like that to express themselves and to get the word out.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you so much. And I'm conscious of asking rather daunting big questions, so we're, I hope, opening some strands that will provoke further discussion and consideration among ourselves, but also among the audience listening, that we kind of hear what are the big open threads that we need to still pursue when the art comes down. In that connection, I have a closing question which has come into the chat from the live stream. And I think that it's one that perhaps might condition our responses as curators. So I'm just going to say it out loud before we switch over to the closing statement from the curators. And it's from Robert in Canada. Robert asks, what can people from or with families in other countries facing this type of state oppression take from this exhibit? And perhaps that's something that when we finish our comments, we can try to answer. So thank you, Robert, for that question. I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues, to co-curators, for our final comment, and our first talk, I think, will come from Balázs. Is that right? Yeah,
sure.
Oh, great. So we'll use the podium now and switch over, and then you'll have lots of them.
Do I do another final comment or is it final comment?
This is curator's response.
Curator's response, all right. Curator's response, it's related to some of the themes that came up in the Provost opening remarks, but also in I think what Catherine mentioned as well, and I think in Nick's question, and it's the importance of courage and art, and Nick asked the question about wellness as well. So we have this kind of general assumptions about artists being brave and courageous to produce images. That made me think about a documentary that we watched a few weeks ago. Again, thanks to Mandy for the recommendation. It was part of our Resistance Film Club. That's a documentary about a painter in Hong Kong. It's called Hong Kong Blues, I think. I Got the Blues. I Got the Blues by Angie Chen. And this is about an artist who's a painter in Hong Kong who just simply refuses to accept any assumptions that outsiders or even the director of the film makes about him and his inspiration to produce or to create. And the documentary is quite an exciting conversation about the meaning of art between these two, between the director who wants to produce a work of art that is a documentary, and between the painter who is meant to become the protagonist of that work of art but refuses to do so. It's really fascinating, so I would highly recommend it. And at some stage, the director asks him about his inspiration to create, and he doesn't say courage or wellness or aesthetic pleasure. He says it's fear. Which is again his way of responding in unexpected ways to assumptions. And he says that it is, you would expect this fear from governmental repression or political repression whatsoever, but he actually says that it's the fear of losing the fleeting moment to create. So my question would be, and my comment would be, of course, based on the interventions of our speakers today, would be to explore the importance of fear and essentially acknowledge that these artists are human beings as well. They have frustrations, they have anxieties, they are afraid. They are, of course, incredibly brave as well, but fear is also a constant element of their day-to-day life, and it's very, very important in understanding their art and their artwork. If you look at, for example, the images here on my left, produced by V.A. Wong Sir, I think trauma, fear, sadness is very much a part of it, and it actually shows a lovely sequence from fear, desperation to hope. And I think our exhibition demonstrates that very sequence as well. So there is anxiety, there is fear, there is trauma, but ultimately art contributes to building up resilience. And I think on the other end of the room, there's a lot more hope there, and we actually have an image called hope. So that would be, I think, my immediate response to what has been said before. We do need to understand these artists in a more complex way. They're, of course, incredibly brave and courageous, but we have to acknowledge the importance of fear that plays in the production of artwork. And I just hand it over to Mandy now.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful kind of summation of some of the feelings we felt about artworks in the room around us, and also picking up the themes from our speakers as well. I was just overwhelmed by the contributions actually that we have this afternoon from the panel, really, and also from the Provost and from Eve and from ourselves as curators. I originally have some thoughts written in relation to what's been happening in Hong Kong even just today, because of the fact that the police authorities in Hong Kong has warned the people of Hong Kong that they cannot really commemorate the June 4th Tenement Square massacre, because obviously today is the 2nd of June and the June 4th anniversary is happening in 2 days, this Saturday, and there have been people who were arrested previously for just being part of a candlelight vigil, which Hong Kongers had a tradition to hold these annual candlelight vigils for almost 30 years before the authorities shut it down. And I think about what Catherine has been saying about listening and what what Jessica has been saying about this kind of repression that we have been witnessing kind of not only in Hong Kong but just kind of outside of Hong Kong because of the reach of the national security law. And I'm just so grateful for the fact that we actually do have a very effective listening space in the context of this webinar and our open launch before, and the conversations that I had from people who visited this exhibition of ours. You know, the engagement that we have on the Lennon Wall, that we have as part of the exhibition, the messages of support, not only from Western countries, so we have messages of support from Canada, from US, etc., but also from mainland China, from Taiwan, and it's quite moving to read these messages, and I'm just so grateful for them, for the fact that we are really having this open conversation, this engaging conversation, in which we just try to listen to each other's experiences and try to understand the trauma that has been happening of the repressed people. I have to say, I need to clarify that I'm actually not a doctor in medicine. You know, I'm actually working in kind of what we call the narrative medicine stream, kind of looking at not trauma and resilience, not from a clinical perspective so much, but from a narrative perspective, try to understand and privilege people's lived experiences as told in their own words. So I'm very grateful for the fact that we actually have this space to be able to open up ourselves and connect Hong Kongers' stories and narratives to the wider audience. And for example, like, you know, in Catherine's talk, we had these wonderful connections between different artists internationally and their works, and how they also resonate with some of the themes that we have been seeing in the artworks around us today. So I just hope that for the people who are with us on the kind of online joining us, that we will actually, you know, have the courage to continue these conversations, because it is so vital to actually, you know, keep up our spirit for conversation and for listening. So I hand you over to Nick for our closing.
So in my sort of curatorial response to what we've been thinking about, I'll start with Robert's question from Canada, because this question of asking how does this help? You know, that's a fundamental thing that we approach every time I think that we get up to teach, or that as an artist or a theater maker myself, when I go into the studio, you know, you're thinking I'm doing small work, local work. I'm in a community setting in a very limited capacity, and my capacity is limited by my surroundings, by my connections, by what this is. I may wish for universal change or universal impact, but I'm working at a local level every time. And so I think this is my first real experience as a curator in visual arts in this experience. And I think the types of questions and problems that arose, I recognize them from the theater. I recognize them from the applied drama space especially, you know, thinking how do we connect community, how do we honor those voices, how do we not step on those voices with our own, how do we privilege the sound of what we're hearing, and then also how do we deal with choice within that, you know, this process of selection means deselection, the process of, you know, whatever it is that we do. But the thing that I keep going back to, and maybe this speaks more directly to Robert's point, is that I was never in that curatorial process alone, and we as curators were never alone. We were always reaching out, supported by community. Both of you are an example of that, but certainly Eve and certainly the Provost and the whole environment which is here, the artists themselves. And the thematics of not being alone have been a persistent thread of this, both operationally and in terms of the art. And so I suppose the message, if there is one, for those who feel, I can't get to Dublin and see this art, I don't know what this is for necessarily, or I can't see, you know, how does this help, is I think that people in societies where freedom of expression is constrained is not to confuse that with the limitation on the imagination. The imagination remains still free, although it is a contested territory these days. I think the imagination has an independence from that, but that there's also others who are around you, who are thinking, who are imagining, who are dreaming, and that there are others outside of that repressed context who want to hear those stories, who wish to privilege those voices and find them. And so reaching out to one another, reaching out to others, maintaining that space of imaginative freedom in the self. I think these are survival strategies for dark times. And we've experienced it at the smallest of scales, living in a society which for now has the benefit of being a peaceful one by and large. We are not at the same degree of threat as some of the people whose voices we're hearing today. And yet, we've also learned how that privilege is temporary and fragile, and it always remains something to be defended and preserved. So I'd really like to thank our two speakers for the role that they play in defense. This is something I thought of in the Provost's comments about defense versus education. Education is defense. It's much more effective defense of the society than defense itself, in my experience. But that connections and solidarity and expressions of culture, expressions of learning, these are transformative in small and slow ways, perhaps, but I think ultimately much more durable and hopefully less harmful than some of the ideas we might have about European weapons, other than our ideas. Okay. I'm going to let the final word be Balázs, I think, as on the schedule, to say thank you from us for the Center and the Center for Resistance Studies. So, final word.
Can I take that?
As you wish.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I hadn't prepared anything in advance because I wanted this to respond on what has been said before by the panelists, and of course I did not know that before the panel actually took place. So my comments will be partly reflection on, or be related to Robert's question in a certain way, what can we expect from art or what can we do? It's partly a response to what Jessica said about, I really like your example about the prison letters and the doodles, so like to refer to the resilience and the endurance of art, and of course the resilience and endurance engendered by art. And also to a question that the Provost has asked us when she visited the exhibition a few days ago. You might remember, fellow curators, that she asked us about, what is their hope for Hong Kong? Which is of course a very pessimistic question, but looking at the political situation, looking at Hong Kong from the perspective of institutions, from the perspective of democratic institutions, of course, civil liberties and so on, the situation looks indeed quite grim. But if you look at art, there is, of course, hope there. So there is hope for art, and as long as there is hope for art, there is, of course, hope for broader society as well. So I'd like to return to the very title of our exhibition and the notion of hope, because I thought that we should end our sequence of events on a more optimistic note, really, and the importance of art in essentially creating hope or engendering hope, and of course contributing to the development of social resilience as well. And as we have known, we all know, of course, the examples for that, whether we acknowledge it or not. Art has survived the worst dictatorships of the 20th century, Nazism, Stalinism, and so on and so on. It endured and it created resilience, and art was pervasive even in the most depressing condition. Artwork, for example, when we had Ukraine was mentioned a couple of times today. We had a lot more modest exhibition than this a few years ago about resistance in Ukraine, and we had a few images of artwork that were produced by Gulag Soviet labor camp prisoners. So this is the direct parallel to the prison letters from Belarus, which also shows that art is pervasive. It exists even in the most unlikely conditions, in concentration camps and in labor camps, in times of terror. And it's there to provide solace, it's there to provide hope, and it's there to essentially contribute to the build-up of resilience. And it's acts as a form of survival strategy. So art is pervasive, just like other forms of resistance. As we know from Foucault and other theoreticians of resistance, resistance is everywhere. And in a similar way, art and artistic production, creativity, to use a more general word, is also pervasive, and it survives in all conditions. As for the endurance of art, there is a great example also from Ukraine, and of course it's a legitimate example, and consider the broader political environment today. There was a museum in Kyiv which contained some fantastic constructivist paintings that were deemed for destruction, were considered bourgeois decadent by the Stalinist regime in the 1930s. But they survived because of, again, the little people that you have already referred to, museologists and archivists. They did what they do best. They put those paintings in storage. And of course nobody ever found them. And of course they also forgot about them. And they were recovered in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you have some fantastic Ukrainian constructivist paintings in that museum that survived because people just, just put them in storage. So it's a fairly mundane act, and it goes back to Robert's question as well. You don't have to, create a revolution. You don't have to bring down governments and totalitarian regimes. You can be an archivist and indeed contribute to change and help build up social resilience and so on and so on. So that's a fantastic story about how the most unlikely people, the Frodos of our times, could bring about change. So the comment really that I wanted to make is the importance of art in building up resilience, and of course the similarities between art in being pervasive and being in endurance and resistance, which is also pervasive, and it survives in conditions in the most unlikely and in the most depressing conditions as well. So what this exhibition wanted to bring about is essentially this general message that art creates hope, and as long as there is hope for art, there is of course hope for even the people of Hong Kong, more generally speaking. And on that note, I'd just like to thank the audience for being in the room, our online audience. I would like to thank, of course, Provost Linda Doyle for opening our event. I'd like to thank the Long Room Hub again for hosting the exhibition, for funding the exhibition, and of course for hosting this discussion. I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers today for their insightful and thoughtful contributions, and finally my fellow curators. I have learned an awful lot from the two of them in the past few months, in the past year or so. So thank you all. The exhibition is still open, and it will remain open until the beginning of July. So this is for the online audience. If you haven't seen it yet, you still have a chance to watch some of the fantastic paintings here in the next few days, weeks. And with that, thank you very much, and goodbye.